I want to have a lesson that's very, very simple this morning. I want to talk about some passages to think about concerning worship. And there are several passages, and some of these are very well known, some not so well known. But when you talk about worship, I think sometimes people disparage worship. I know I've used this illustration so many times, and to say, I guess you shouldn't criticize a person who's after he dies, but Don Williams' song always really bothered me, where he was saying, I don't believe that heaven waits for only those who congregate, and really the implication of that was that worship was something that really doesn't matter, didn't make any difference, that it was a non-essential as we've begun to call things in today's world, that it really was just totally irrelevant and had nothing to do with anything. And so it kind of bothers me that people have that attitude toward worship. And so I thought I would just go down the list and look at some passages that talk about worship. Now, one of the most common passages, but usually we only read a small portion of it, is the 122nd Psalm. The 122nd Psalm is the passage that says, David said, I was glad when they said unto me, let us go into the house of the Lord. But it's interesting to read the rest of what he said. Our feet shall stand within thy gates, O Jerusalem. Now he's talking about Jerusalem because the temple was there, and it was the place of worship. Jerusalem is builded as a city that is compact together, which I think is an interesting passage. Because what he's describing is the fact that the tribes of Israel had a relationship with each other that was important. And when you transfer this to the New Testament, you think of what David is saying. He's talking about us having the house of the Lord, which would equate to the church. And our feet will be firmly planted there. And that we are in agreement with our brethren of the importance of it. And then he goes on to say, whether the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord, under the testimony of Israel, to give thanks unto the name of the Lord. It was the place that was a place of congregational worship. That is the temple, that they would come together outside and worship as the priests would conduct the various activities inside. The Lord's church is not exactly like that, but it is in a sense. If you think about the New Testament church, a lot of what is stated there can be done outside the assembly, but at least two of the things that are mentioned there are congregational activities. They're things that we do as a group. One would be the Lord's Supper, of course. We, upon the first day of the week, come together to break bread. We'll talk about that a little bit later in our lesson. And the other is putting our contribution into a common fund for the promotion of the work of the Lord's church in that particular locality. Now, those are two things that really are part of our assembly. Now, during the time that we were separated and couldn't come together to worship because of the COVID deal, we did the best that we could, and we all tried to have the Lord's Supper at home and either gave, mailed, or made up our checks so that, or in our contributions so that the church's work could continue. But that's not normal. That's an abnormal, very unusual situation. I've been living 73 years and I've never seen anything like that in my lifetime, and I hope that I never do again in my lifetime. Normally, it is something that we all should look forward to, that we all should think about that, what he said. I was glad when they said to me, let us go in the house of the Lord. So often, people look upon some things with dread. Now, I don't mind telling you that last week on Tuesday, final day was Wednesday, but on Tuesday, Pat and I wrote a check to the IRS. It was a pretty big one, and I didn't like that at all. And I didn't do it with any sense of gladness or any hoorah or any shouting for joy. I looked upon being robbed by someone who was wasting money and was asking me to support their wasteful activities. Now, that's kind of the way I looked at it. And I can't look at the Lord's church that way. I can't think, just think of all the things I could do with the time that I've got, that I'm going to go and waste it in worshiping God. That's the way some people think, but that's not what the Old Testament says that we should do. And it's really not the attitude that we see expressed by people in the New Testament. So we need to think about it. What is our attitude toward worship? Do we view it as something that we enjoy, that we look forward to, that it's something that we consider to be a great privilege that God has extended toward us, and it is something that we need to give some thought to? Second thing is this. What do I hope to get out of worship? Now, people's expectation of what they're going to get out of worship has changed a lot over the years. And people have begun to think more in terms of what I really hope to get out of worship is a uplifting experience from the standpoint of being entertained and just really having a big time. So you see, worship services have gradually changed over the years, and they have begun to resemble going to a rock concert or a country music concert or something of that nature, and they don't really resemble anything that you read about in the New Testament. When you come together to worship, what is it that you hope to get out of it? Well, in Hebrews chapter 10, and it is the famous passage, I didn't put verse 25 and should have and didn't. But if you begin in verse 22, now let's stop and think for a moment first before we go any further. We need to stop and think about the circumstances here. Paul wrote this letter to Hebrew Christians in the first century. Hebrew Christians in the first century were opposed by Jews tremendously, even to the point, as you look at with Paul, of actually killing them and putting them in prison. So they were being just persecuted relentlessly. Now, as a result of that, a lot of them quit worshiping. It's pretty obvious from what he said in verse 25. That's the problem. They just quit. They said it's just not worth it. But Paul said, there's this old saying, and I remember years ago reading it. It talked about, a lot of you here are not old enough to remember the old Charles Atlas course. If you listen to Statler Brothers, you heard it referred to. But there used to be this deal of people who could take a New York City phone book and rip it in half. Now, I'm going to tell you, that's a pretty hard thing to do. Now, it's not hard to rip it in two, just one page at a time. That's simple. Anybody here, even a small child, can do it. But if it's the whole, ripping it in half is very difficult. So they had these contests where people would actually try to rip it in half. And there weren't many folks who could do it, but a few could accomplish it. So Paul talked about the fact that we draw strength from one another. And we do. There's even an illustration I heard one time about a person who quit and didn't attend church services anymore. And someone went and talked with him, and he was saying that it really didn't seem to help him much. And the guy that's talking to him reached into the fireplace that was in front of him and pulled out an ember that was glowing red and set it off by itself. You ever try to build a fire with one stick? Now, unless it's exactly the right kind of wood, that's a pretty hard chore. You don't build a fire with one stick very well. And so the ember just went out. And his point was that we need each other, and we need to be with each other, and we need to assemble together, and so we need to do that. So when we think about worship in the sense of a public worship assembly, what do we hope to get out of it? Well, Paul said this, "Let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience, our bodies washed with pure water. And let us hold fast the profession of our faith without wavering, for he is faithful that promised. And let us consider one another to provoke unto love and to good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as a manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching." So what his point is that we hope to encourage one another. I know that sometimes people say numbers don't matter. And I realize that, and a lot of preachers will say that. And I've tried to condition myself not to, because here's the facts. Most Christians who have been attending worship services for a long period of time have a tendency to look at the board and see how many we had last week and how many we've got today, and they'll look at the contribution. Those are some things that they'll kind of normally look at. And it encourages them if that number goes up. the higher that number gets in attendance, it just makes people just get pumped up. So I know that. Now, I realize that that's not the end-all, be-all. I had a fellow one time who came for a funeral in Florida. He was from Minnesota. And it was his son-in-law who had died in a motorcycle accident. And he and I were talking, and he asked me how the church in Valdosta was doing, which I immediately proceeded to tell him what the attendance was and what the contribution was. And his remark was, I didn't ask that, I asked how the church was doing. And I thought, that really tells you a valuable lesson. That that's not the only thing that has anything to do with it. We could have thousands there in either regard and still not be pleasing in the sight of the Lord. So what we really need to learn is that we're trying to encourage each other to be obedient to God. And that's really what we hope to gain out of our worship assembly. And then the question comes sometimes, is a large crowd necessary to worship God? There's some people who really, in our society, look down upon, usually the word is small or small rural congregations. And they say, I even had a member of the congregation in Columbia one time to sit and argue with me that every small rural congregation in Murray County should close their doors, not meet anymore, sell their buildings, and bring the contribution and put it into that particular church that he was a member of's coffers, and all the members assemble them, and that's what he thought should happen. Well, what he basically is saying is small churches are not important, and they're not valuable, and they have no real relevance. I've, in my lifetime, very seldom been a part of a church that had more than 50 people attending regularly. Almost never. Have a few times, but not many. And I don't really see the difference in that. I believe that what Jesus said, wherever two or three are gathered together in my name, there I am in the midst of them, is true. And that our worship is just as relevant, just as acceptable, as if we had 10,000 members in attendance here. So I think we need to kind of understand what we're trying to do. Are we trying to demonstrate how many we can get? Sometimes if you take that approach, and you're really only interested in the numbers, what you end up doing is the way that you increase the numbers is you just lower what the expectations, and then the lower the expectations get, the higher the numbers get. That is a problem at times. We have to be careful we don't fall into that trap. If we preach the truth and large numbers obey, then I'm thankful for that. If we preach the truth and no one obeys, then I'm going to keep trudging on because it's what God requires of me. But when I come together to worship, I respect all you folks who have a like common faith as myself. And as we worship together, I just appreciate each one of you so much. And then the question comes here, and it really relates back to the last question. When I'm worshiping God, who am I trying to please? I mean, what is the purpose of that? I've used this illustration before. You may or may not have heard it. I was in a meeting, or actually attending a meeting in Tallahassee, Florida one time. And the preacher, who at that time was Conway Skinner, he actually invited us over to his house, a bunch of other folks, and there was an older guy that was there. And even by Larry would take offense. He was actually 80, so he was, to me at that time, I was 30. He was an old man. But they were sitting there and they were talking. And they got into a discussion about the song leading and the songs they had that night. And this old gentleman said, that's because you like to sing and I like to worship. So it was kind of a cutting remark. But his point was that the worship is important. And if the song leader is not the greatest song leader in the world, and he may miss the key a little, may be a little distracting. Sometimes it gets very distracting. But he said, still, the worship is what's important. I'm trying to please God. In Matthew 6, in verse 5, when Jesus was talking about prayer, he said, some people like to love to pray standing in the synagogues and in the corners of the streets. In other words, they want all the publicity they can get. And he said, verily I say to you, they have their reward. If we do anything for the express purpose of pleasing anyone and making them happy and not for the express purpose of worshiping God, he's saying, then that's a problem. Now, can we make singing better? I don't have any problem with that. Have a singing class, try to learn the parts, that's great. Because I do realize this, that it is sometimes something that distracts us and pulls us aside if there is a mistake made. That happens. But on the other hand, we still have to remember who it is we're trying to please. I used to live in a town where the song leader for the congregation promoted on the sign out front every week and in their bulletin and on their radio program was one of the Oak Ridge boys. Now, they had a lot of folks come to sing. I mean, you get one of the Oak Ridge boys to be your song leader, then you've got a pretty good draw. But really, what are you trying to accomplish there? Are we going to work? Is that singing any better than when Larry leads our singing here? Is it any more acceptable to God? That's really the question, and that's something we need to give some consideration to. Then another thing that comes to mind sometimes is, do I plan my schedule to include time for worship? Is that something I do? Do I try to keep my schedule clear for those activities? Well, the Apostle Paul was traveling, and as he was traveling, he came to Troas in 5 days, and he abode there 7 days. It seems pretty apparent to me why he abode there, because upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, he really planned it so that he could be there, and he could meet with them, and he could preach to them, and he could be included in their worship. So it's something we need to kind of give some thought to. And let me ask you this question. Do I consider spiritual activities as essential? We hear this word essential all the time. Essential, essential, essential. What's essential? What's not essential? I tell you something that's really bothered me an awful lot is when I hear that in the state of California, church service is considered non-essential. Marijuana shops and liquor stores are considered essential. I don't get that. But anyway, man's trying to decide what's essential and what's not. In Matthew 4 and verse 4, when Jesus said when he was asked the question, what was the greatest commandment? Actually, I'm looking at the wrong one. I'm sorry. In Matthew 4 and verse 4, he was being tempted, and the devil comes to him and tries to get him to make this stone into bread, and he wouldn't do it. And he made a statement, and the statement he made is a tremendously important statement. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. Let me ask you something you stop and think about for a moment. If you look at our nation and the problems, and Joe mentioned some in his prayer today, some of the problems that we're experiencing, what is the cause? The cause is a 3-letter word. That's the cause. It's sin. That's the problem. Now, how would you deal with that? It would have to be dealt with from a spiritual perspective. You can't deal with that with a physical perspective. I mean, you can do it to a certain degree, but you can't really control that. It's kind of like, if you want a real illustration of what I'm talking about, it's this. New York City has adopted a policy of if you're too poor to pay it, they don't have any cash bond. So when they arrest you, they just carry you to jail, and then they turn you loose on, as they call it, your own recognizance, and just say, here's your court date, come back. Had a fellow robbed a bank. So he went to jail, and they processed him, turned him loose. He walked down the street, robbed a second bank. So you're not going to control people until you control their attitudes, to control what their motivational factors are. Religion fills a void that people don't understand. The world doesn't understand it. A lot of people look at you, and you attend a worship service this morning and tonight perhaps, and Wednesday evening, and maybe go to a gospel meeting, or whatever it is that you're doing in worship to God, and they look at you and think of that as being a total waste of time, that it really accomplished nothing. Well, if we have that attitude, then we have a real problem. And some people need to understand that our worship is something that's important to us. I mean, it's important. It's something that's an intricate part of our life, and it has a lot to do with who we are. The Apostle Paul put it this way in 1 Timothy 4 and verse 8. bodily exercise profiteth little. He didn't say it was not profitable. He said it profiteth little. The reason it profiteth little is this. You can exercise all you want. You can eat as healthy as you like. And it is appointed a man wants to die, and after this the judgment. And that's a fact. And then you'll live eternally. In Columbia, there used to be a heart doctor. His name was Dr. Fuqua. And Dr. Fuqua was a heart doctor for me. And he was I went to him at least twice I can remember, maybe 3 times. I'm not certain. And when I went to him, he was a really hard-nosed kind of a guy. I didn't know him personally, but people who lived close to him said that when he was in his 90s, he was still out jogging every day. But I'm not sure where he's buried, but you can find his headstone today. And that's why Paul said it's profitable little. It does some good, but you're only going to live 70, 80 years. So whatever you do about bodily exercise, it's going to last that long and no more. But godliness, he said, is profitable in all things, having promise of the life that now is and that which is to come. So it's just something we need to think about. Spiritual activities need to be valued. They have a value. And we can't look at them as being just nothing to them. Just we can do with them without them. It's just simply not true. And you think about this. Do you have a real purpose in worship? When you come to worship, I mean, do you think about it? I think sometimes we have become acclimated to worship. And I have. So during the time, for example, when we weren't meeting, I really had a pang of guilt every time a worship time came because I've been conditioned over my life. Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday night you went to church. So it was a problem for me because those times were kind of specific times. And I have kind of developed a habit. I understand that. So I never even think about it. On Sunday morning, that's where I'm going to be. On Sunday night, that's where I'm going to be. On Wednesday night, that's where I'm going to be. If we have a meeting, I have no question about it, I'm going to be at it. Unless there's something that hinders me, that I will. But overall, if you think about your worship, what is your purpose? I mean, what do you really purpose to do in worship? The Lord said in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 28, talking about the Lord's Supper, He said a man ought to examine himself. What that means is he needs to determine out what is his purpose in eating of this bread and drinking of this cup. Why are you doing that? Well, he had told you why. You were doing it in remembrance of me. To remember my blood, remember my body. And he said, he that eateth and drinketh unworthily, eateth and drinketh damnation to himself, not concerning the Lord's body. Now, a lot of people read that wrong. A lot of people say unworthy. And so what they're thinking of is that you got to sit down before you take the Lord's Supper and think, is there any kind of sin that's going to hinder me of the Lord's Supper? That's really not what he's talking about. That doesn't say unworthy. It says unworthily. And I'm not an English scholar, so I'm a little out of my element here, but it is an adverb, modifies the verb, not the noun. It means what we're doing, is it acceptable? That's what it's talking about. Does it have the acceptable purpose? Are we remembering? Are we really doing that for the purpose that God has given it? Or are we just going through the motions? Which is it? He goes on to say this. For this cause, many are weak and sickly among you, many sleep. But he says this too in verse 31 that's so important. If we should judge ourselves, if we would judge ourselves, we should not be judged. You know, in the United States, we have what's called a voluntary income tax. Did you know that? They call it a voluntary income tax. You know why? Who is it that reports your income? Now, if you work for somebody and they send in your W-2 form, that's one thing. But if you work for yourself and you work in a situation where you get a 1099, then, or as in my case, I get a K-1, those things aren't reported to the government. They aren't even reported. So if you don't report them, now you could get caught, and you might, but you might not. That's why they call it voluntary. Have you ever thought about the amount of taxes in the United States that are not paid because people don't go through with it? They don't turn in everything? You sometimes hear people say, well, if I get a check, I report it if it's paid in cash. I don't. Well, what they're saying is that you have to judge yourself. You know, my daddy used to tell me something about ethics that I think was probably one of the best statements I ever heard. He said, you know, you need to live your life and conduct your activities so that when you get up and you look in the mirror, which we talked about in class this morning, every morning to shave, that you can stand the man you're looking at. And a lot of truth to that. Because you're the one. You have to judge yourself. When we pass the Lord's Supper a little bit later, and you partake of the bread and you partake of the fruit of the vine, there's not one single person in this audience who knows whether it's worthily or unworthily but you. And that's what God is telling you. He's saying, you know, the Lord's church is an honor system. The one difference is that I don't know what you're doing, but God does. He knows the thoughts and the intents of the heart. So He knows. And one day you give an answer for that. But you're going to be the one that makes that decision. So what is your real purpose? What are you really doing? You know, I don't. How big must an event be to cause me to change my plans to worship God? That's sometimes something that comes up. Just how big? Well, you know, that's a difficult question to answer. And you're really talking about something that's kind of a matter of judgment. And I understand that. Some might make one decision, some another. But one of the guidelines would seem to be when Jesus had this parable about the man who made a feast and he invites all these people, and people began to react to that. And so he sends out his servant at supper time to tell them to come. And they all with one consent began to make excuse. Now, you know, when you think of two words, there's two words that are sometimes hard to distinguish between. And you have a hard time with them. One is excuse and one is reason. Those two different things. So what really you're trying to do is you're trying to decide, is this an excuse or is this a reason? And that's the decision you have to make. So when you're trying to decide, you have to say, is this an excuse or is this a reason? Now, I often say that if you don't want to do something, one excuse is as good as another. So it doesn't matter. You can offer any excuse you want to. But reason's a different thing. If something has a real reason, that's a different situation. Now, at the end of this thing, when all these people offered these various excuses, one said, I bought 5 yoke of oxen and pray, have me excused. Another said, I've married a wife, can't come. Another says that, you know, I'm a person that's bought all this land and I've got to go see it, so you just excuse me. He doesn't seem to accept those as being legitimate reasons. He looks at them as excuses. And he goes on to say in the last of that none of these men was forbidden shall taste of my supper, which so the Lord is really giving you some guidelines to use. Now, specifically, would we all reach the same conclusion? No. Years ago, Pat and I lived in in Jennings, Florida. We preached for a congregation called the Oak Grove Church of Christ there between Jasper and Jennings. And we had a fellow there by the name of Horace Royals, and Horace was dying. And he had cancer, and he was in terrible shape. He came to church on Sunday morning, and he could he'd walk from one pew to another and have to stop and rest because the fluid would build up so bad he was about to smother. And that night, he and his wife, of course, lived by themselves. They were an older couple, and it came time for church, and she wasn't going to go. And you know, he made her go. He said, if I die, it's not going to make a difference if you're here or not. You might as well go on. And she showed up. She wasn't real happy with it. Now, she reached a different conclusion than he did. He said, that's not a reason. She said, that is a reason. But he prevailed, and she came. But it just shows you how there can be some difference sometimes in conclusions we reach. I understand that. But we do need to give it some thought and think seriously about it when we think about worship. And let me ask you this question. Do my worship habits reflect the greatest respect for the greatest commandment of all? Just think about it. When you think about this passage I tried to quote earlier by mistake, in chapter 22, when Jesus was asked this question, what's the greatest commandment in the law? He said, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind. That's the first and great commandment. At this time, we're not really interested in the second because that's not what we're talking about. We were in our class this morning, so we mentioned it. But here we're talking about that first one. Our worship habits reflect what we believe about that? Do we really, in our minds, think that the greatest commandment, the greatest responsibility I have in this life is to love the Lord my God with all my heart, with all my soul, and all my mind? Is that what we believe to be true? You know, there's only one person that can answer that question. I kind of forgot I had one more point. Only one person can answer that question. We mentioned that already, and we've talked about it a little bit again. The Apostle Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 13, and I'll tell you one reason he wrote it, and you can see it when you read this entire passage, verse 3 through 7. He said in verse 3, "You seek a proof of Christ speaking in me, which to you word is not weak, but is mighty in you." One of the problems that most of us have, I won't say all of us, but maybe I shouldn't say most, maybe I'll just say many, because there are many who do. Many people tend to look at their behavior as to whether it's right or whether it's wrong by looking at someone else's behavior and comparing it to it. So in other words, the lowest standard that we pick as the standard that we accept and then bring ourselves as close as we can to that standard, that's where we're going to be. And so what Paul said here is, you seek a proof of Christ speaking in me. He goes on to say, though he was crucified through weakness, yet he lived by the power of God. For we also are weak in him, but we shall live with him by the power of God to you. Examine yourselves whether you be in the faith. I mean, what standard are you going to use? Are you going to look at me and say, well, there's Nathan's behavior, so I'm pretty good compared to that. Maybe you might say, I'm better compared to that. I'm better than he is. Let me ask you a question, so what? What difference does it make? It doesn't make any. What matters is, if we look at the standard of God's Word, there's not a single person in this audience who will say, I'm absolutely perfect. That's the problem. So there's the standard, and that's what we're shooting for. And that's why Paul said, examine yourselves whether you be in the faith. You don't examine yourself to see how you compare to me. I've never played golf a day in my life and don't know anything about it. But I hear a lot of people who do play golf say you don't play against the people you're playing with, you play against yourself. That that's the person you're playing. You ever notice a lot of golf players go play by themselves? They don't even carry anybody with them. They don't really care what the other person's score is because that's irrelevant. What's relevant to them is, what's my score? How good am I? Well, that's kind of the way it is being a Christian. You have to examine yourselves whether you're in the faith. Know ye not your own selves how that Jesus Christ is in you, that you be reprobate. But I trust that you shall know that we're not reprobates, talking about the apostles. Now I pray to God that you do no evil. Not that we should appear approved. Now think about it. Not that we should appear approved. But that ye should do that which is honest, though we be as reprobates. You look at that and think about it. When I lived in Valdosta, we had an instance that happened in a local community, and it was a Free Will Baptist church. And I do not believe it is typical of Free Will Baptist church preachers. But our next door neighbor was a member of the Free Will Baptist church, and we had a lot of spiritual conversations. And he came over to my house one day, and I didn't read the newspaper, so I didn't see it. And he said, you know, our preacher, there was a place called Jennings Beach. It was a place on the river. It had sand on it. And folks go down there and sunbathe and all that kind of thing. And their preacher had gone down there and had dressed himself as a woman and had on a bikini, and he was sunbathing, and he got arrested. In this days and time, he wouldn't got arrested, but those days and time, he did in the 1970s. And he looked at me and he said, you know, that sure does hurt at church, doesn't it? I had a hard time keeping from laughing and say, yeah, it probably does. But should it? Suppose that I today go home and murder someone. Does it have anything to do with anybody else in the congregation? No. But it's kind of the way the world looks at it. And that's what Paul is saying. He's saying when it comes down to it, the one you have to have a relationship with is God. And what other people do is irrelevant. I've learned, you know, you hear this statement sometimes that people make. They'll say, you know, I've got enough trouble taking care of myself. Well, it kind of comes from a passage like this that says, hey, when we think about our attitude toward worship, is everybody going to think I'm everything I ought to be? Probably not. But when you think about God, who am I really trying to please anyway? I mean, there's a relationship with God there. But on the other hand, I can't say, well, I'm better than the average person, because that doesn't matter. What I need to be doing is looking at God's Word and saying, I want to judge myself by that standard. And that's what I'm going to look at. And when I look at my life and ask a question, I'm not going to ask, am I kind of up to the center of the road? I'm going to say, am I to God's standard? If I'm not, then I need to correct it. And that's really the intent of this lesson to accomplish. We're going to sing a song of encouragement. If you're not a member of the body of Christ, you ought to be. You ought to repent and be baptized for remission of sins. Be a member of the body of Christ, worship Him regularly, serve Him in a faithful manner. We certainly give you that encouragement together, stand as we sing.